Hello everyone. You all know that we have had this recent Conference of Parties meeting taking place at Baku in Azerbaijan, and it has achieved some mixed result. So we should try to understand the overall process of climate change, what measures have been taken to deal with it in these number of years, and specifically what issues had been there in these Conference of Parties meeting, especially the recent ones, where what all we have achieved and where we have failed. So to start with, the efforts for environmental conservation and dealing with climate and other issues, it started somewhere in early 1970s. As we know that United Nations, it organized its first conference on human environment at Stockholm in 1972 in the context of the rise in the global environment movement. The global environment movement, both in the developed countries as well as in the developing countries, it had become slowly active in the decades of 1960s and 1970s, and therefore a number of issues it had arisen, and now the international community, it realized that it was high time to deal with them. So a conference was organized in 1972 at Stockholm, which resulted into the establishment of United Nations Environment Program, an agency under the United Nations which will take care of the efforts related to environmental conservation. Thereafter, in the decade of 1970s as also in 1980s, the environment movements, it becomes more widespread. It reached to the grassroots level. It became more active in the developing countries also. And in these 20 years, a number of issues had become important. And therefore, after 20 years of that, the world realized that it should again organize a conference on the environmental issues. This time, it was organized at Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in the year 1992, which is popularly called as the Earth Summit. And Earth Summit, as it was organized, it came up with a number of achievements, especially with respect to Agenda 21, which it adopted for sustainable development. Along with that, it came up with two important conventions. The first one was the United Nations Convention, Framework Convention on Climate Change, and another one, United Nations Framework Convention on Biological Diversity. Apart from that, it came up with a Rio Declaration, which included a number of principles to deal with the issue of environmental conservation. It also came up with a statement on the principles of forests. Besides this, it ultimately led to the establishment of United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, and thereafter the issue of climate change also will become slowly more and more important. Now, there had been a difference in the changing world order, because now we have entered or ushered into a new era of liberalization with the start of 1990s, and the whatever differences that had been there because of the power blocks between the developed and the developing countries is somehow began to metamorphose into a new reality. And because of this, we could see that the developed and the developing countries, the differences as they were there earlier, both the group of countries, they started to come together. So at the Rio Summit, a lot of negotiations took place, and where the developing countries, they wanted to assert themselves, and they tried to ensure that no matter the growth needs to be dealt with, needs to be cut down in order to deal with environmental challenges. But the developing countries now were firm that until and unless the developed countries are going to provide them the finances, some kind of aid, they will not be ready to do so. So this is how the issue of finance also started to emerge. So we had this very important United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted at the Rio Summit. And this is here, it was dealing with, first and foremost, it established a principle wherein the developed countries will have to take the lead to deal with these issues of climate change. So they were following the principle of equity, and as all of you must be knowing, common but differentiated responsibilities. That means there is a common responsibility of all the nation states, but of course there will be difference in terms of their capabilities, their resources, and their priorities, because there of course be difference between the developed and the developing countries. So RC stands for their respective capabilities, so common but differentiated responsibility with respective capabilities, and also the principle of equity. So both these principles were to be considered in order to deal with the issue of climate change. So this was established under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Besides this, this convention, it also talked about that it will be the conference of parties. That means 200 countries which were a party to this convention, they are going to meet annually at a meeting, and this annual meeting will be organized at different places in different countries, and this will be called as conference of parties, which is going to take the stock of what all changes have happened, what all has been achieved under the conventions every year, whatever it has agreed to, and how the new set of measures need to be taken up. So conference of party is a meeting which is happening annually in different parts of the country. And this is a supreme decision making body of the convention, which also reviews the implementation of the convention, as I told you, as also the legal instruments which are adopted at conference of parties. Now by these legal instruments we mean that the conference of parties in its meeting, it usually agrees to some of the legal mechanisms like protocols, some accords would be signed to set up certain new targets with respect to either emissions or transitions as far as fossil fuels are concerned, and such number of other issues which we are going to deal with. So this United Nations Convention on Climate Change, it had its first meeting, that means first conference of party, it met in Berlin in the year 1995. At this conference, first and foremost, they started to talk about that how they should be reducing their greenhouse gases from 2000 onwards. So they had started to build up an agenda for that. Besides this, the differences between developed and developing countries was still persisting, especially on certain issues like the developed countries, they had been disposing of wastes in the developing countries. So there should be certain restrictions on this cross border, hazard disposals and all that. So this was also one of the issues at the first conference of parties in Berlin. Then after this, we are not going to discuss all the conference of parties. We'll just pick up the important conference of parties here. Like for example, the next one will be the COP3, which was held at Kyoto in the year 1997. It resulted into Kyoto Protocol, which is of course well established, a protocol before the Paris Agreement. This was the first legal binding. It entered into force in February 2005 when the required number of countries, they ratified the agreement, so it came into force. United States, it was not part of the Kyoto Protocol. That also had become a major issue. Kyoto Protocol basically was for setting up certain targets for limiting the greenhouse gas emissions. Here the principle that was mentioned in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is common but differentiated responsibilities, itself was followed, and more responsibilities, as I mentioned earlier, was kept on the developed countries. As first agreement that brought in a binding emission reduction targets, and what was this target? It was signed by 36 industrialized countries and the European Union. It had set up a target that 5% emission reduction should happen compared to the 1990 levels. That means whatever emissions were there at the 1990, the countries are going to bring it down by 5% from the period starting from 2008 to 2012. So this is the period. Please mind, this is a period we have to take into account. That means Kyoto Protocol, it was to be implemented between this period of 2008 to 2012. And in 2012, the Kyoto Protocol was supposed to end, and it has to be followed up by either a new protocol or a new legal binding targets. But we will see whether this could happen after 2012 or not. So the countries, they would start to take certain initiatives, and the conference of parties will also be meeting to make an assessment of all this. In the Kyoto Protocol, they had also included 3 important mechanisms, which are the market mechanism of how to reduce the greenhouse gases. So the 3 market mechanism which were there was, first one was the clean development mechanism. Under the clean development mechanism, the developed countries, they were supposed to invest in the developing countries, and this is how they will overcome their responsibility of emission reduction, and the developing countries will also get some benefit out of this. This way, the developed countries may be able to continue with their growth process as well. In the joint implementation, the developed countries were supposed to invest in another developed country. So one developed country would be investing in another developed country, and this is how it will fulfill its responsibility under the targets. Under the emissions trading, they were talking about establishing a carbon market where the trading of carbon credits can take place. But this, of course, it took a number of years to get formalized, and obviously you must have heard that in COP29 they have now formalized it by establishing the rules on these carbon market. Okay, let's go ahead now. Next summit we are talking about is the Copenhagen summit on COP15. So we move straight away to the year 2009. Slowly things were being achieved, but most of the time, whatever targets had been set up under the Kyoto Protocol, they could not be achieved as much. So under the Copenhagen, the idea was to start a discussion on new set of targets and what could replace the Kyoto Protocol. So at Copenhagen, the discussion started, but there were a lot of again differences among the countries. So what happened that they could not reach to the legally binding set of targets or any protocol, but what resulted into a political agreement, that is what was called as a Copenhagen Accord. Political accord means that, or Copenhagen Accord, it meant that the countries would commit themselves towards achieving these targets, but they were not legally binding. So as such, Copenhagen Accord, it could not replace the Kyoto Protocol, right? Kyoto Protocol, remember, was to continue. That means the results were to be achieved by the year 2012. So before 2012, we were supposed to set up the targets, but at Copenhagen, it could not be achieved. But what was achieved at Copenhagen was that for the very first time, they could quantify now on the climate finance. Now, climate finance issue is centered around how the developed countries need to provide finances or aid to the developing countries in order to deal with climate change or the greenhouse gas reductions. So this is the first time where they could quantify, that means how much amount of money needs to be given by the developed countries to the developing countries, and this target was set to be achieved by the year 2020, that is 100 billion US dollar will be given every year by the developed countries to the developing countries, and this target of $100 billion was supposed to be achieved by the year 2020. So this, for the very first time, was included in the Copenhagen Accord. Next important summit was the Cancun summit, COP16 in 2010. The importance of this summit lies in the fact that for the very first time now we started to talk about a long-term goal also of what is to be achieved as far as dealing with climate change is concerned. So you may have heard about some such targets also under the Paris Agreement. So for the very first time, it was at Cancun that they are now talking about that long-term goal would be to limit global warming up to what level? It says that to below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level. That means whatever global warming is happening after the industrial revolution, that means if you go back to the pre-industrial level, whatever level of temperatures were there, in all these years, the temperature should not increase beyond 2 degrees to what was there at pre-industrial level. So it should be contained below 2 degrees of what was there under the pre-industrial level. So this is a long-term target which was established. Another, they also formalized the setting up of a green climate fund. So when this issue of climate fund has come here, let us also take a brief review or get into the framework of how the finance mechanism it has started to work. See, we had a United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It talks about climate finance. That means how the fund needs to be generated, and especially how the fund needs to be given by the developed to the developing countries. For that purpose, it includes Article 11 of the United Nations Convention itself. In this Article 11, there is a mention of financial mechanism, which says that the financial mechanism, it needs to be entrusted to the existing international entity. Now, what do we mean by existing international entity? Means some fund which is already existing, that would be given the responsibility also to deal with this. So here in what happened, they decided that the Global Environment Facility, GEF, which was already established, this facility was established under the Rio Earth Summit, right? It came into existence and it was providing small grants. So basically a fund was created which was providing small grants to the community organizations as also to the grassroots organizations and NGOs and all that in different countries. So this global environment facility itself was entrusted to deal with financial mechanism also under UNFCCC. So this led to establishment of a number of funds under the GEF also, and apart from GEF some more funds were also established afterwards. So initially they started with GEF, but later on under UNFCCC they established some more funds. For example, under Kyoto Protocol they have adaptation fund established, and as we mentioned earlier itself at the Cancun they had talked about green climate fund. So the green climate fund will also be established under the UNFCCC. Later on at COP17 meeting in Durban in 2011, they agreed that the green climate fund, which was established already in the previous COP, right, the decision was taken, this green climate fund will be operating under the UNFCCC. So they have talked about green climate fund and they will say now this will be exclusively for the purpose of whatever is required for UNFCCC. It will be used for that. So this is how the green climate fund, it will come into existence, which is going to be the main financial mechanism to deal with this issue of the greenhouse gas emissions reduction and all that. Thereafter we will also see the establishment of further more specialized funds, like recently we have seen establishment and formalization of loss and damage fund as well. So Kyoto Protocol, it was to be implemented between 2008 and 2012. Now 2012 you have to establish a new legally agreed protocol, or some kind of agreement has to be there. So Copenhagen Accord could not achieve that. So what happened at the next phase of the Kyoto Protocol, that means the Kyoto Protocol was extended, and this happened, decision was taken at Doha at COP18 in 2012. So what we consider this to be COP18 Doha, it took a decision that the Kyoto Protocol will be amended and it is going to be extended further as a second phase also from 2013 to 2020. And under the Kyoto Protocol, for the second phase now the targets have been changed. Lesser number of countries, because some of the countries they were not able to fulfill their responsibilities earlier also, so the targets were also a little more ambitious here. So lesser number of countries became party to this agreement, and they committed to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by at least 18% below the 1990 levels. That means in the first phase we had to cut down the greenhouse gases by 5% for what was there in 1990 levels. Now in the second phase of Kyoto Protocol, they are saying that they will cut it down by 18% below the 1990 levels. So this was an important decision that took place at COP Conference of Party meeting in Doha in the year 2012. Let's go further then. After this, we had the Paris Agreement taking place, because obviously after 2020 you will have to set up a new target. So the discussion for that will have to start, and in fact you have to set up a new legally binding agreement. So for that purpose the Conference of Parties, they met at Paris, and this is perhaps one of the very successful of Conference of Party meetings, as you all of must be knowing, in 2015, and they signed the what is called as a Paris Agreement. Of course, Paris Agreement will come into force from January 1, 2020, so it will be formalized. In the meantime, various steps will be taken up to deal with various issues. A number of issues will also be increased under the Paris Agreement. Let us quickly look at what issues were there. So it required parties that they will put their best effort through NDC. So here you see the principle has changed now. Earlier we were focusing upon common but differentiated responsibilities, and now the focus is on NDC, which means nationally determined contributions. Nationally determined contributions is not a new concept. Nationally determined contribution was there earlier also, but earlier it was not just NDC, earlier it was called as INDC, that is intended nationally determined contributions. That means before the Paris Agreement. And earlier INDC, it was also not a legal binding as agreement or having a legal binding or a principle. Rather it was just a kind of a voluntary pledge by different parties that they would like to set up some targets for their national contributions towards reduction of greenhouse gases and dealing with climate change. But now from INDC we have moved to NDC. The difference is that even NDC is not legally bound. Rather, here this will show a higher political commitment. That means the countries will be more serious about the commitments which they are making as far as these targets are concerned. So nationally determined contributions, this new principle is going to be focused now on how the climate change issue is to be dealt. Then the agreement also focuses upon the transparency framework to ensure that how there can be transparency in the making of policies, in setting up of targets, in different countries fixing up their nationally determined contributions. Now this means that all the countries, they will voluntarily fix up the targets as to how much will they be able to achieve in the next 5 years. So NDC is fixed up for 5 years. So 2020, 2025, then 2030, they will come up with these different targets, all different countries, what all they can contribute as far as emission reduction is concerned. So how well they fix up their NDCs and how they are implementing the projects, all those things, there should be transparent reporting. So there should be transparency in policy making, setting targets. There should be transparency also in the process of implementation. There should also be transparency in terms of how the reportings of these will happen, on the basis of which the real assessment can be made. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, it talks about carbon market. This we are going to discuss in detail as part of COP29 later on. Then COP also talked about Article 9, which is the finance mechanism which has been agreed. So probably the extension of the previous itself, but of course now we will have some more ambitious targets as far as financing is concerned. And the long-term goal has been very categorically specified in the Paris Agreement. Remember this we had already mentioned earlier as well in the Cancun summit or Cancun COP as well, where they have fixed up the long-term agreement. Then they had said 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, right? They will limit the warming to below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now they are saying that this they have to achieve, but rather they would prefer to make it go even below 2 degrees. That means they say that now we will try to limit it to 1.5 degrees. That means whatever the temperatures were there at the global level in the pre-industrial times, now they would try to achieve it to be or limit it to be below the increase of 1.5 degrees to what was there in the pre-industrial times. So this is a more ambitious target which has been set, and then now they are also saying that we should achieve the net zero levels of emission by the second half of the 21st century. One good thing about the COP as it has happened, and as the efforts have been taken up by different countries, that we have become more and more ambitious towards achieving these targets, and now we have ushered into these phases where we are preponing those targets, means we are trying to achieve those targets much earlier as well. So remember that this is something to be achieved like 2 degrees, limiting the increase below the 2 degrees as the net zero emissions by the second half of the 21st century. Then let us also see some more features in the Paris Agreement by differentiating with the Kyoto Protocol. So what major differences had been there, that the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. Kyoto Protocol, it was a commitment of the industrialized countries, right? So the responsibilities were not there on the developing countries as such in the Kyoto Protocol, but in the Paris Agreement there is going to be responsibilities. Everyone is going to take the responsibilities by the NDC, their nationally determined contributions. So it has been 195 signatories, and all those countries will be committing towards some set of targets. Of course, they will be voluntary determined targets also. Kyoto Protocol focused only on the mitigation, that is cutting of GHGs, whereas the Paris Agreement, it apart from focusing upon mitigation, it also focuses upon adaptation and loss and damage responses. So obviously adaptation is how people are adapting to the global warming and climate change that is happening in different parts of the world, and loss and damage response is like the climate catastrophe which is increasing, or hazards which are coming because of the climate change which is happening, how the people are going to deal with the losses they are going to meet because of these. And here also how the in developed countries they can provide some kind of aid to these countries. So that's an issue, loss and damage response and adaptation added to the major issue of mitigation. Thereafter we see that here the wealthier nations not only to provide finance but also the technology, and this will be in a more comprehensive manner in comparison to the Kyoto Protocol. So here there are more specific commitments towards achieving these. Implementation through the nationally determined contributions. Earlier the principles, as I told you, was common but differentiated responsibilities. National targets have to be fixed, as I mentioned again earlier, in 2025 or by 2030. Then US was a signatory to the Paris Agreement. To Kyoto Protocol it was not. And here in case of Paris Agreement, later on we see that there has been withdrawn during the Trump's era, and this again has become a major issue, like when the COP29 meeting had been happening in Baku, then only we got the result of the US elections, and a lot of speculation is going on whether the US is going to be party further to these agreements or not. Next one is the COP which happened in Scotland, in Glasgow in 2021, where the developed countries, they reached to this conference by their not meeting their targets. Remember, these targets was fixed up for how they are going to finance the developing countries, the target of US $100 billion a year. They were falling short on the targets, so obviously they are going to make some more ambitious targets. I mean, at least not in terms of legally binding targets, but at least some voluntarily agreed targets would be there. So Glasgow Climate Pact was signed. What all it talks about? It says that now let's see, it is going to become a little more specific. We had been talking about the reduction of greenhouse gases in general. Greenhouse gases includes a number of their components. We have carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, and so on. So now we are also focusing upon the specific components in the greenhouse gases. It says that the carbon dioxide emissions should be reduced by 45% so as to reach a net zero around the mid-century, right? Then it says that we should phase down the coal power and also remove all the inefficient fossil subsidies which are being given. Then it said that the NDCs, because it was surely falling short on their ambitions, so they made a call for a stronger national action plans. Right, this is what we said, that they could not achieve some of the targets. Not this was related to finance, this was also related to their nationally determined contributions. Those also could not be achieved. So in both the cases, with respect to finance as well as the NDC, the targets which they were fixing, they were not able to achieve. So they said that we should be setting up more ambitious target, and then what was to be fixed up for 2025, we should try to do that before, and we should try to fix up the NDCs. That means the different countries, they will announce their NDC goals by the year 2022 itself instead of 2025. So this has been preponed slightly. Okay, now also COP27, which happened at Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt in 2022. Here we could see that they also created another fund now, loss and damage fund, which has been created, and in Sharm el Sheikh COP, one more decision was taken up. This was related to the reduction of methane. So now they took a pledge that they will be cutting down the emission of methane by 30% by year 2030. So that's another target which has been set in specific terms at the Egypt COP, that is Sharm el Sheikh COP. Then of course the previous one in Dubai in 2020, this was in 2023, the COP28, the decision which was taken up was to make some more long-term ambitious targets. That means, you remember in the Paris Agreement we said that they have to bring down the global warming to below 2%, right, and preferably to below 1.5% of what was there in the pre-industrial times. Now they are sticking to 1.5 degrees. They are saying that we should be able to achieve this 1.5 degree target itself somewhere by the mid of the century. And they also talks about reducing the emissions. That means net zero emissions should also be achieved around the mid-century. And most important decision was taken up with respect to the outcome of the first global stocktake. Global stocktake means that whatever measures that have been taken up, what all changes are happening on the ground. So those assessments are being taken up, and then there are a lot of synthesis reports also being prepared by taking up whatever developments are happening in different countries. So there is an assessment that happens, and on that basis, what outcome is there of it and what decision should be taken in response to that. This was the focus area of the COP28. So now we come to the recent one, COP29, Baku in Azerbaijan. So herein all of you must have been going through the newspaper and various readings, and we already know major issues. I'm just summarizing that. So this is, we met at Baku in order to reach to the next steps in tackling climate change, and around you see 200 countries participated, 5,55,000 participants. That's a big number. In huge number people participated though in this conference, and it has been dubbed as the Climate Finance COP because that remained the main issue, right, of this conference of party. New target, higher target than 100 billion. So finance, the target earlier was 100. You remember we talked about that in the Glasgow conference, the developed countries, that means until the year 2021, they were not able to achieve this target, right? And this target, remember, earlier was fixed for the year 2020, and even in 2021 they could not achieve this target. Now they are saying that we have to agree to a new target, right? Because till 2020 there was a target, now new target has to be set up by the year 2025. So they say we have to set up a new target which should be higher than $100 billion. So on this there were a lot of differences, but this was perhaps one of the major issues that was to be discussed at the conference. And then just a figure which is to be quoted here, that by this time, that means 21-22, now the countries have been able to mobilize $115 billion, right? Remember in 2021 it was slightly less than that, but then a year after that it reached to $115 billion that the developed countries were contributing to the developing countries. So if this has already been achieved by this year, then what target should be set up? That is what is to be seen. So what are the major issues or agenda which was there as part of the COP29 summit? They were to discuss something on the nationally determined contributions. That means new set of goals which has to be fixed for the year, by the year 2025. Some countries were already announcing for 2030, some have already announced for 2035 also their goals. There are certain countries which have done so. Climate finance was another issue, fossil fuel transition, rules for carbon market, transparency framework, as I mentioned, as part of the Paris Agreement itself. In fact, most of the things were there in the Paris Agreement. So these are the issues now to be discussed in more detail, and what new levels of achievements could be there with respect to them. And then loss and damage. So I repeat, the nationally determined contribution, climate finance, fossil fuel transition, rules for carbon market, transparency, adaptation, and loss and damage. These had been the major issues which were to be discussed at the COP, or which rather were discussed at the COP meeting at Baku. Out of these, some major achievements have happened with respect to rules for carbon market, with respect to loss and damage, with respect to transparency. I think these three areas are where a major strides have been taken up. I repeat, rules for carbon market, with respect to transparency, and with respect to loss and damage. Thus, Conference of Party, they could not agree to the expectations of the developing countries as far as climate finance is concerned. Fossil fuel transition, whatever was promised in the Dubai COP, that means COP28, that also hasn't been discussed here now. So it was a failure on the account of fossil fuel transition. As far as adaptation is concerned, it is more or less on the similar level as it was earlier. And with respect to NDC, obviously they will try to fix up more ambitious targets. So let us just quickly look at all these issues one after the other. As far as NDC is concerned, nationally determined contributions, the countries are to update their NDCs by February 2025 under the Paris Agreement. Now herein, the call is for, in the summit, they made a call for ambitious national targets and also accelerate their net zero GHG goals. In the final draft of the document also, they have talked about enhancing ambition to reduce GHG emissions. Three countries, as I told you, UK, Brazil and UAE, they have already announced their 2035 NDC. That means they have set up their goal for NDC for the year 2035 itself. That has been announced in this conference. And there a new group has been created, which is called as G0, which includes the countries of Bhutan, Suriname, Panama and Madagascar. And these have already achieved the net zero emissions. That means they are not releasing any extra. In fact, some of them are what we can call some of them as carbon neutral, and some of them may be in deficit. That means they are releasing much less than what is being, what is already there. So net zero GHG emissions have been achieved by these four countries, and they have made a group of their own, which is called as G0. And this is how they will try to inspire and motivate other countries and share some good practices, some of their case studies also, so that other countries also can take up some inputs and learn from their examples. Next one is the climate finance. Of course, the most important issue at Baku conference was climate finance. And here they are now talking about this new construct, which is new collective quantified goal. And you must have heard about this mostly in the discussion in the COP. New collective quantified goal, NCQG, basically is a new set of targets which the developed countries are going to provide in terms of finances to the developing countries, which earlier was $100 billion per year, that target. This needs to be revised, and after revision this is what will be called as NCQG. So finance for transition from obviously fossil fuel and curbing GHGs. So new target to be set before 2025 when the current 100 billion pledges expire. So what was proposed by the developed countries, that they said instead of $100 billion per year, by the year 2035 they will start giving $250 billion per year to the developing countries, right? So this much they will achieve by 2035. So this has been set up as NCQG. This is what they had proposed initially. But developing countries, they had the expectation of somewhere around 1.3 trillion. This is what, and in certain quarters of the developed countries, they also agree probably that this much level of at least 1 trillion of such finance is required. But at the present level, they could not commit themselves to more than this much of target. So what happened was that this was seen as highly inefficient, and then the summit, it went into overtime. They could not reach out to consensus on this, so they were discussing it further. So next round of negotiation started, and after that the countries finally decided that they will triple their finances. So from 100, now they have announced that they will be contributing 300 billion annually by the year 2035. So this is the most important outcome, but of course this outcome is important in terms of the issue what was there. In terms of achievement, this is considered by most of the people is falling short on what everyone was expecting, because everyone expected that probably the developed countries will be able to contribute somewhere around 1 trillion of finances to the developing countries every year. Next issue is a fossil fuel transition. As I said, not much breakthrough has taken place here also. In fossil fuel transition, at the Dubai summit, they had agreed that they will be transiting away from fossil fuel in energy systems. So first time some agreement was reached on fossil fuels there at the Dubai COP. But what has happened here in COP29, they discussed the pledge which they had taken at Dubai. And what was the pledge? The pledge was also, of course, that transition will happen. They had said that they will triple their renewable energy capacity and double their energy efficiency. Triple their renewable energy capacity and double their energy efficiency. This pledge was taken at the COP28 in Dubai. This pledge they discussed at COP29, but not much breakthrough happened beyond this. Rather, in the final text or the final document which was there, they did not even mention about the issue. So this has seen as rather a very regressive approach towards this issue, and many people are criticizing this, that this is like we have gone back on the promises which were made in the Dubai COP. Next is another most successful areas which was there for the conference. On the very first day, certain agreements reached as the rules for carbon market. So we have this issue. Remember that in the Kyoto Protocol itself there is a mechanism of emissions trading. in the Paris Agreement also they have talked about establishment of carbon market mechanism. For this carbon market mechanism, how will it work? How the trading will be happening? Will it be bilateral among the countries themselves, or will there be any multilateral fora or some kind of a regulated market internationally? So what options have been given under the Paris Agreement itself, we will have to look at. So carbon credits, the concept is that carbon credits are nothing but these are just certificates. So you can put your effort or run a project wherein you can cut down on the emissions and you can get it certified. Now, who's cutting down the emissions? This can be done by any of the entities. It could be a company, a private company also, or it could be a government also, which is trying to cut down the emissions, and it gets it certified, and this certificate itself will be seen as a carbon credit because it's mentioned there that how much of reduction has happened as far as the greenhouse gases are concerned. So these certificates then can be traded once against the other. So in there is a requirement of a market. For example, one country which has, or one company which has achieved some credit for themselves, they have done the reduction, someone else can purchase that. So this way what happens, the other entity will also be fulfilling its responsibility, and the earlier entity, it will be making some profit out of selling of these credits. So that's understood how the market mechanism works. So herein, earlier it was traded only by the companies on an unregulated market. Now this was already there, this was already happening, so companies had been doing it. But under the Paris Agreement deal, they said that the countries can also participate in emissions trading. And what mechanism was included in the Paris Agreement? It talks about this issue in Article 6. And in Article 6 also there are two different clauses. One is 6.2 and the other one is 6.4. Article 6.2, it is related to country emissions trading. Okay. And Article 4, so here Article 6 we are talking only about country specific trading which is happening. So companies are already doing the trading. We are talking about in Article 6 it's country wise trading that is happening. There also two different methods are there. One is under 6.2, it's country to country, and under 6.4 they talk about establishment of a centralized carbon market under the UN. So this is going to be a regulated market now where different countries they can participate. So now what has happened at COP29, that the global carbon market, it has been approved, and they have established, they are allowed the countries to trade the carbon credit, and the UN under the UN rules, and it will also be supervised by the UN. So United Nations will come up with a comprehensive set of rules and how this entire regulation will happen, how this market will function, and then how countries can participate. So this is one achievement which has happened in COP29, that we have had the global carbon market getting approved. So country to country, what specific, because this is important, right? There can be questions related to this particular issue itself on the global carbon market, what achievements have been done. So as far as country to country, which is covered under Article 6.2, here basically COP29, it provides clarity on first of all how the countries will authorize the trade of credits, right? So respective countries, how will they authorize the trade of credits, how it can happen, I mean with respect to other countries, and then how will they maintain the registry, right, which is how will this is going to tackle the entire operations. So these two issues related to country under 6.2, that is bilateral mostly, and this is related to the centralized carbon market rules under the UN. For this they have said that they will establish certain standards. So agreement for this was reached on the day one of the conference itself, and the consensus on methodologies for framing standards for projects. What consensus have reached on the methodologies for framing the standards for projects? Herein they say that we will set the standards, and in the standards they will have to take care of certain things, right? When they are going ahead with this kind of trading, then whatever emissions they have been reduced or certificates they are going to take, they will take care of certain issues. What issues will it take care of? First and foremost, if it is having some kind of an environmental impact or some human rights issues are involved. Second is the rights of the indigenous people, whether they or you are having an informed agreement with the indigenous people and their rights are recognized. Third one is they will allow any kind of appeal or complaints to happen, as also the UN carbon market to align with science as mentioned in 6.4. That means this carbon market, it will be aligned to science as per the Paris. Okay, as far as adaptation issue is concerned, now in the last year, what had happened is that countries had agreed to come up with a framework. In fact, they had come up with a framework of guidelines which will provide some direction to the national adaptation plans. So different countries, they come up with their national adaptation plan. With respect to that, these guidelines have been committed to, which will help the countries to have their national plans in order to help their people to fight the climatic disruptions because of the impact of climate change. And on that basis, we see that further action needs to be taken. But these framework which were made over here, they were not having much details, especially related to the quantification of the targets for measuring the progress, and also how the projects, they are going to be linked with the finances. So these two details were not there. So it was assumed probably that in this COP29 some discussion will happen in this direction, and further goal setting will become easier and possible. So in relation to that, at COP29, now they had hoped for specific adaptation goals which to be discussed further in the next COP, that is COP30, that will be held in Belém in Brazil. Along with that, they have also taken up extensive discussion on the second 5-year assessment with respect to the formulation and implementation of the national adaptation plans by different countries. Then with respect to least developed countries, with respect to LDCs, in their provisions, whatever provisions have been included in the draft of COP29 with respect to LDC, they are talking about a support program for them so that they can actually better implement their national adaptation plans, formulate and also implement their national adaptation plans. So overall, these things have been included in the Baku roadmap for adaptation, which has been taken up. So this will guide in future the adaptation issue in further conference of parties. Next issue is of loss and damage. Herein some progress have been made, whatever was discussed earlier as part of COP27 in Egypt, and they had also established the loss and damage fund at that point of time, which is of course headquartered at the Philippines. Now this one, financial assistance will be provided through this to the vulnerable countries, and the present COP29, herein they have fully operationalized this fund now. So an agreement has been signed regarding that, and the fund will be ready to finance the project from next year 2025 onwards. And then we have the transparency issue, the last one, which has again seen some major strides over here. Transparency to be ensured with respect to target settings and with respect to action plans, with respect to reporting and other things, also how things are being implemented. So that is how the nationally determined contributions and the net zero pathways, they are to be set up by different countries. So there has to be transparency in that, and also it is focusing upon recognizing the efforts of non-parties, whatever other stakeholders are there. So what contributions are they making, that also has to be brought under discussion and to be reported in a transparent manner. So transparency, especially reporting, has taken a big stride here. All the transparency items have been concluded successfully at COP29. Transparency reporting that has seen some breakthrough, and they are saying that evidence base will be provided to policy decisions, right? Because now they will have the data, the information, the cases, the experiences from the grounds in different countries. So it will be easier in policy making. So there will be transparency, and then of course in identifying the financing needs and opportunities also. So here also a great deal of transparency in fact is required when you are measuring the finances from different countries and what expectations will be there with respect to project, because that somehow will be helpful in determining the overall targets of finances. And then of course 13 parties, they have already submitted their biennial transparency report at the conference. So these have been the achievements. Apart from this, some other activities which happened at COP29, one of it is related to the declaration on water for climate action. Second is global carbon project study report has been presented. Then there's an independent high-level expert group on climate finance. It submitted its third report. This group was established by COP26 and COP27. Under that, it has been functioning. And UNFCCC, it also presented the LTLEDS synthesis report at COP29. So this is basically the low emission development strategy. On that, whatever progress has been made by different countries. So basically, synthesis report is the one wherein they bring up, all from all different countries, whatever has been reported, and they combine it to form a synthesis report. So these four, you can get the details from the documents which will be available on our Telegram channel. The link of the Telegram channel would be given in the description of the video. You can get it from there. And also you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, because we will be frequently coming up with these kind of videos now. And let's see then the gains, major gains in the conference, what they had been, which I have already more or less summed up earlier as well, is a full operationalization of loss and damage fund, which was there, totally operationalized from next year, as we mentioned. It was going to start financing the projects. Operationalization of carbon markets, you have already seen that. All transparency negotiations have been concluded, and renewed calls have been there for more ambitious national climate goals. So these could be seen as some kind of gains from the COP, but then it failed in its ultimate objective related to financing, right? So couldn't achieve much on central goal, which was where it failed to meet the expectation of 1 trillion finance, which is to be provided by the developed to developing countries. And of course, there's no breakthrough on transition from fossil fuels. So there may be other issues on which much breakthrough hasn't happened, but these are the ones where there was a lot of expectation. So this is all as far as this particular issue of COP29 and UNFCCC and other issues related to climate finance is concerned. So please do subscribe to the channel, and we will keep bringing you such videos. Thank you so much for joining.